Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Theology Thursday. I'm Pastor Chris Laughlin of Messiah Lutheran Church. Joining me, as always, is my eminent and wise friend and colleague, the Reverend James Smith, pastor of St. John Lutheran Church in Three Rivers, rector of Trinity Episcopal Church, also Three Rivers. How are you this morning, Pastor James?
Exceedingly eminent. Cheers.
We have to be well hydrated when it's this hot outside, so.
I'm drinking dark coffee. All right. No, it's because I think Docetism, Arianism, and Adoptionism are sizzling, steaming hot topics, right?
Well then, let's jump right into it. Today, in this week's edition of Wrong, we will be talking about some of my favorite heresies. Actually, well, not all of them are my favorite heresies, but most of the ones we're talking about are indeed my favorite heresies. And we'll begin with Docetism. Now, we say Docetism, D-O-C-E-T-I-S-M. However, it's originally from the Greek dokeo, or to seem, because, according to the Docetists, Jesus only seemed human.
Yep.
And you, Pastor James, have some truly interesting references in some of your notes on today's topic. Shall we start with Mark chapter 15?
Sure. Yeah. Are you bringing it up right now?
I am.
All right.
Shall I screen share?
Go for it.
This, of course, is Jesus on the cross, right? When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he is calling for Elijah, Eloi, right?
Wasn't.
And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and exhaled, right? Breathed his last. Or expired.
Expired, yeah.
Literally kicked out his spirit.
Yep.
The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last. He said, truly this man was God's son. So tell us, Pastor James, what has that to do with Docetism?
It doesn't, but it can be wrongly understood that way. So we think that the Gospel of Mark was the earliest of the Gospels, written around, what do we think, like 65, 67, somewhere in there?
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. And so there's a lot in Mark that is kind of, I would argue, not as theologically worked out as other parts of the New Testament. And so we start with this quote. We'll have one later on that can also be misunderstood. But this part here is, it's a really strange part where it's called the cry of dereliction. And it's kind of a strange part if you think that Jesus is God. And even the centurion there seems to think that Jesus is God's son. Then why is he crying out that he's being forsaken? So there are kind of these different ways of trying to explain it. A lot of it goes back to our Trinitarian controversies. Are the Son and the Father having sort of a disagreement? Is it even child abuse or something like that? Or there's another view that comes out that actually, at this point, the divine Jesus has kind of left the human Jesus on the cross. So it's the human Jesus that was like, hey, we were friends, we're going through all this together, and all of a sudden it's left abandoned for the hardest part. I don't think that's what Mark meant, and most people don't think that. But the Gospel of Peter thought that this is what was meant. Now let me see. Can I read a quote from that?
Please do.
Okay, so this is I'm going to be honest, I'm freely borrowing from Wikipedia since I don't have the Gospel of Peter in print copy. If any fans want to write out and sponsor that, we can get you some bonus content. So it says Christ's cry from the cross in Matthew, given as Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which Matthew, he has this also explains this meaning, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is reported in Peter as my power, thou hast forsaken me. Immediately after, Peter states that when he said it, he was taken up, suggesting that Jesus did not actually die. This, together with the claim that on the cross Jesus, quote, remained silent as though he felt no pain, has led many Christians to accuse the text of Docetism. And what they mean by that is that Jesus only appeared to suffer and die. I think I just want to note real quick that no less a scholar than Bart Ehrman, who wrote Introduction to the New Testament for great courses, as well as kind of every poke that Christian Bear in the side book that's been out in popular culture the last 20 years. He says that this is actually not Docetism, technically, because Jesus' spiritual self was in the body and then it's separated. Whereas your pure, 200 proof Docetism would be that Jesus, the real Jesus, was never inside the body at all. And this one, he's kind of in it until the spiritual Jesus is in it until the going gets tough. So he'd say it's more separationism than Docetism. I think you're making a distinction without a difference, because the ultimate argument from Docetism has always been about, did God suffer and die? And it's clear that in this part, it only appeared that way, that he didn't actually.
According to the Docetists, right?
Right.
And there were and have been strands of Christianity which have wanted to separate, because as we're talking about this, it's jogging something in my memory about Jesus being taken up from the cross before he actually got a chance to die. And it's not just in Christianity where that's the case. But I want to, if I can, before we get there, I'd like to spend a minute in Luke 24. It's important you say that Mark is not necessarily as fully theologically fleshed out. And remember that none of the New Testament is dealing with some of the later questions that come up. Mm-hmm. But if I can read just briefly from Luke 24 here. Jesus appears to his disciples. This is after the resurrection. You can see the resurrection is at the beginning of Luke 24. He hasn't appeared to the rest of his disciples yet, just the women and the folks on Emmaus. While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your heart? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So if you didn't get it, Jesus has a body.
Right.
Jesus is still fully human, right? Hands are wounded. Ghosts don't leave footprints. That's why they're looking at his feet. He's physically eating fish, and it's not – I don't know if you saw the new Casper movie when it came out, or the more recent Casper movie. It came out a decade or two ago. And the ghosts in there, Casper's, I think, uncles, are throwing food into their mouths, and it's just falling out of their bodies, right?
Right.
Ghosts don't eat food. Jesus does.
Yeah. And I think you and I both think that this is kind of an early attempt to, it's not a coincidence that story in there. It's an attempt to, whether it's full-fledged Docetism against or whatever, like I think it was an attempt to fire back at that side. And here's another little interesting thing. The verb that, so it said they were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. It's actually and it seemed that decay, it seemed to them that they were seeing a ghost. So I have no idea whether that's actually an intentional little wordplay there. Possible.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And you think of another word for ghost is like apparition, which again is that word appear is another meaning. So it's really clearly fighting against that. Do we want to save our other gospel story later, or do you want to go into it now?
Well, actually, we have several other gospel stories. So I'm sorry, I've got a lot going on in my head. What are you talking about?
Oh, sorry. John 20.
Oh, let's go to John 20 now.
John 20 is very similar to this story. We get it the second Sunday of Easter every year. It's been responsible for some truly terrible sermons year after year, myself included, I would say.
Seminarian Sunday, the Feast of the Seminarian, when every Sunday preaches the exact same text, right?
And by year 3 or 4 of seminary, even the seminarians run out of new things to say. So,
or what sounds like new things to them, right?
Right. So this is the one Jesus appears to the 11, and Thomas is out, who knows what, on a beer run or whatever. Jesus appears to the 10, I should say at this point, right? Because Judas has left the scene. And then Thomas says, unless I put my hand, unless I see the mark in his hands and his side, and I put my finger in there and stick it right in, I will not believe. And it's interesting. I have often heard this preached that Thomas thought the news that they were telling him was too good to be true. And we've all been there, I think, where it sounds too good to be true. That's really kind of like I'd say a response to 20th century American marketing. Like you see it on TV, can you really trust this? I don't know that it was a question for them back then, but one question that was live was Docetism. And so I think you and I understand this now, that Thomas believed they saw something, but what he doesn't think they saw is a physical body of the resurrected Jesus. He thinks that they saw his apparition or his ghost or whatever. Think about in Acts, there's a story where Peter's released from prison, and the servant girl Rhoda, who comes and she says, "Hey, Peter's at the door," because he had this miraculous escape, and no one believes him, but they suppose that maybe she saw Peter's angel or Peter's ghost. And I think part of what's going on in the story is the author of the Gospel of John is trying to say this wasn't just an apparition or an angel of Jesus that they saw; it's a real thing. And if you don't believe it, here's a story about Thomas, who kind of had that same doubt, but came to be convinced of the physical resurrection of Jesus himself.
Shall we touch briefly that there is a religion which has dealt with this exact same question?
Sure.
So this is, and good job on the research there, Pastor James. This is from the Quran, Surah 4. They that said in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, but they killed him not, nor crucified him. But so it was made to appear to them, and those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For a surety, they killed him not. Nay, Allah raised him up unto himself, and Allah is exalted in power, wise.
Right. So we Christians skip the Ascension because we don't really take the time to celebrate that anymore. It's on a Thursday, and that's for wings or whatever. I don't know. But in Islam, it's almost like they skip the crucifixion and go to the Ascension. They skip the crucifixion and the resurrection. I think this is important because I think there's been a salutary move since all the hatred and bigotry after 9/11 to try to emphasize some similarities between Christianity and Islam. But I think it can go too far, because I think if you take Christ off the cross, what you have is not the same depiction of God anymore. Now, if we were Docetists, maybe we could actually have a much closer connection, because they both believe that the real God would not be, hanging left on a cross for the birds to eat.
Well said. And do you have the revelation of Peter?
I do. So I'm sorry it's confusing because there are a bunch of... Peter was, the head honcho of the apostles. So a lot of the fan fiction from Gospels and such is under the name of Peter.
Fan fiction, I love it.
That's the way I use it. So earlier we had the part from the Gospel of Peter. And remember, that's kind of that separation idea. You see that again in the revelation of Peter. This is written from Peter's perspective. When he said this, I saw him apparently, there's that word again, I saw Jesus apparently being arrested by them. I said, what do I see, Lord? This is pretty, by the way, this is a classic move in apocalyptic literature, like Revelation, for example. You will get an angel or an authority figure explaining to you what you're seeing. And think of Revelation that Jesus actually plays that function, which you hear as well. So I said, what do I see, Lord? Is it really you that they are seizing? And are you holding on to me? So how are they seizing him, but I feel someone holding on to me? And he says, and the one, Peter says, and the one who is the one smiling and laughing above the cross, is it someone else whose hands and feet they are hammering? Well, the Savior said to me, the one you see smiling and laughing above the cross is the living Jesus. The one into whose hands and feet they are driving nails is his fleshly part, the substitute for him. They are putting to shame the one who came into being in the likeness. I'd like to see that word for likeness again, because that could be that Takeo word again too. And into being in the likeness of the living Jesus. Look at him and look at me. When I looked, I said, Lord, no one sees you. Let's get out of here. This is a terrible place to be, man. He answered me, I told you they are blind. Forget about them. Look at how they do not know what they are saying. Kind of a contemptuous riff on they do not know what they are doing.
Yeah.
For they have put to shame the son of their own glory, human glory, material glory, instead of the one who serves me. So in this one, not only does Jesus peace out, but he's kind of a jerk because he's looking at this poor guy like the most painful death imaginable, smiling and laughing. If you've ever read, what's the book by Umberto Eco about the monastery? Sorry, it'll come to me later. The whole plot, there's this argument among the monks whether Jesus ever smiled or whether Jesus ever laughed. And if you simply accept the revelation of Peter, he does, and it's at the cross. So what do you think? What do you think the point of this kind of ridiculous, fantastical scene is? What do you think Docetism are trying to protect?
Actually, but can we come back to that? Because I think that's the if you'll forgive me, the crux of the question.
Uh-huh.
Important thing that we're going to talk about, but I'd actually like to talk about it toward the end, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So then we move on. What's the opposite of Docetism? The opposite of Docetism then is Arianism. Now, we've touched briefly on Arianism, I think, in our episode on the creeds, right? Right. So Arius was actually a bishop, again, Alexandria, is that right?
Yeah, I believe so. Sorry, my computer's running out of power, so I'm trying to do...
Do what you got to do. Do what you got to do.
My power is the gospel of Peter. Just forsaken me.
Can we just stop there and say that was actually what Jesus actually said, according to both Matthew and Mark, was a quotation from Psalm 22, verse 1, one in Hebrew, one in Aramaic.
Right. So that's a good point because it actually shows how much the Gospel of Peter is reworking this. Like, they're not only slightly tweaking it, they're pretty much losing the entire scriptural
basis.
Yeah.
Yeah, they more than sort of missed the point. So Arius was a bishop in Alexandria, nigh on about the year 300, and it's certainly he's at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And one of my favorite stories, which probably didn't happen, but I still like it, from the Council of Nicaea, is where Santa Claus ran down and punched Arius in the face.
Yep.
Because
well, Jesus stood smiling and laughing at the
yeah, that's not in the legend, but I smile and laugh, that's for sure. Every year on, what is it, the 14th of December on St. Nicholas?
December 6th.
December 6th?
Mm-hmm.
What's December 14th, St. Lucia Day or something?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't come from that strand of Lutheranism. So Arius said Jesus was special. Jesus was a sort of first creature. Jesus is not divine. Jesus was fully human and not fully God. Again, special, but not God. Different from the rest of us scum, but still not God. I think his language is first creature, like substance, right? Homoousios,
Right.
instead of like being instead of same being. Pardon me. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say this is really, I think a point I wish I had made in our creeds episode is this is also where you see kind of the Gentile dominance come out, because Judaism, one of the things that the Old Testament is huge on is the distinction between the creator and creation. There's kind of this absolute distinction. And in Greek thought, not really. There are these ideals, but they kind of all find their way into us. And so you meet creatures like heroes like Hercules and such that are hybrids, and that's a pretty Greek solution, but I don't think it takes seriously the really sincere distinction in the Hebrew Bible between creator and creature.
Well, and you could say that I'm gonna blur the lines a bit here, but you could say that the hero, right, is Jesus, and that sort of Greek hero is Jesus in Adoptionism, where Jesus was adopted as God's son in a certain reading again of Mark at the River Jordan at his baptism. I mean, that's not unlike what happens to Hercules, right? Hercules was a human being, sort of, who became a god, sort of, because he's sort of adopted.
Exactly.
And so again, you've got this sort of very Greek thought going on. Athanasius, however, counters, getting back to Arianism, Athanasius counters Arius, and Arianism thrived from before the Council of Nicaea to long after the Council of Nicaea.
Athanasius gets kicked out of his see or his bishopric 5 times. Has to be. He's actually known classically as Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, which should tell you, to quote my 6th grade English door poster, doing what is right is not always popular. And so this was a really hard argument to win. So why don't we get into Arianism and what he's kind of fighting against?
Yeah, and so Arius says that only God is God. And I think all of these have the same problem, right? God is the oblong blue blur of the universe, the creator who is entirely different. God does not suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We separate God from suffering, and it's simply a matter of how. And these become become Christological heresies about Jesus. And it's important that Arius and the Docetists and the Adoptionists are wrong, because it is Jesus who bridges the gulf between God and humanity. In Jesus, God learns what it's like to be finite, to have a beginning and an end. In Jesus, Christ becomes one of us, knows what it is to be one of us, and thereby saves us. Right.
Can I get to this little syllogism from Athanasius that I think is...
Please.
So Athanasius' view is that no creature can redeem another creature because we're all implicated in sin, basically, is the idea. So he looks over at Arius, who says that Jesus is a creature. Now, it may be a first-order creature, like you said, but ultimately a creature. That means that, according to Athanasius, Arius' Jesus cannot redeem humanity because he's a creature just like the rest of us. Another, I actually read a book, or I browsed it quickly. It's called Christian Theology by Alistair McGrath. And it put it bluntly that, in fact, Jesus is he becomes part of the problem under this understanding. So both Athanasius and then later Luther would say that if Christ is not God, then he too needs a savior, like all the rest of us. So I think you put it well by becoming human. God identifies with all of us. God ties himself to all of us in Jesus. But by being God, he is actually able to save us. So it's kind of like if you are drowning, you want someone to jump in to come down with you, but you also sure as heck want to know that the guy actually knows how to swim. So the coming in to save us is Jesus, the coming into swimming with us is Jesus being human, but actually being able to swim to rescue us, to save us, to pull us out of the water, that's kind of the God side, that they're both working together in the Orthodox view.
Well, I would not go so far as the Orthodox, right, to say that God became man, that man would become God. I would not go theosis divination route, although there are Lutherans up in Finland talking to the Orthodox Church, and they're having sort of this conversation.
Well, and it all, that's kind of a short for a very complicated thought. It's a little more palatable, I think when it's like when forget if it's 1 Peter or 2 Peter talks about participating in the divine nature. And the question is what that means.
Right. And Luther's lectures on Galatians, and is it just the forensic justification? But that may be a bit beyond the scope of where we're going to go today.
Right.
But Arius says Jesus is not God. And the Council of Nicaea decides that no, in fact, Jesus was God. This starts, however, with a very practical question. Can we pray to Jesus? Because we can only pray to God. And if Jesus isn't God, then we can't pray to Jesus. But the question of does God suffer is still a relevant one. Because I think all Christians would agree today, yes, you can pray to Jesus, right? Yes, Jesus was God. And I think Arianism, Adoptionism, and Docetism all sort of show their face in different ways today. And the question of, did Jesus smile? Were you and I we were having this conversation during the recording, right? Not before the recording?
Yes. Yeah.
Jesus was a human being, fully human being, probably smiled.
I agree, but I also think he lived a very hard life. So.
No doubt he lived a hard life.
It's easy for us in our climate-controlled rooms to say, he was human, he had a smile. You try living with Herod and Pontius Pilate, friends like Peter and Judas.
I don't know. I think he had a good inward chuckle when his parents were looking for him in the temple, don't you think?
No, I agree.
Did Jesus did Jesus go to the bathroom? I mean, these are things that we don't like thinking about, right? But Jesus was fully human, and so yes, Jesus went to the bathroom. Jesus was
and I think the Gospels of Luke and Matthew really push this point by actually talking about Jesus being born a baby. I think for kind of a Greek thinker, the most humiliating thought of all would be Jesus living in a womb. Start my birthing classes, that sounds pretty messy. Like Hercules had some painful things and did some really hard things. So maybe you could weasel the cross in there somehow, although we've seen plenty of people were uncomfortable with that. But I think the idea of the Annunciation, the Nativity, the kind of early ends of the Incarnation are just as hard for a lot of people to believe as the crucifixion is.
Well, we don't think about it, right? We think about what a cute baby is. That's why I think Christmas is more popular than Easter and Good Friday. But we don't really want to think about what it means to have been born.
Right. And I think one of the reasons that so we were talking earlier, you mentioned that adoptionism, the idea that God says, okay, now you're my son. Mark. It's one of the first scenes we have in Mark is Jesus' baptism. And so that God basically paraphrases Psalm 2 and says, you are my son in whom I am well pleased. Some Christians throughout history called adoptionists have taken that to be kind of performative speech, that it's at that exact moment that Jesus becomes God's son. And this, I think, is one of the best reasons to believe that Mark's the first gospel, because suddenly Luke, Matthew, and John all have something about what Jesus was before that moment. So in Luke, you've got the Annunciation, and Gabriel comes to Mary, and then the birth in Bethlehem, with the shepherds. In Matthew, you've got the angel's appearance to Joseph, birth in Bethlehem, flight from Egypt, the Magi. And John goes all the way back to the beginning, and really it's outside of time, talking about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So all of those in their different ways, I think, are really, if not answering adoptionism, at least giving them a strong obstacle to overcome, which is talking about, no, this Jesus was God's plan from the beginning. Do I need to keep talking?
No, you're good. I'm having trouble finding it now, but this book, which admittedly I haven't read since college, other than the translation at the beginning, this book flat out says Jesus was adopted. Adopted as God's son.
I remember that, yeah, because I've read that, yeah.
So this is stuff that's still floating around today. Some of the, I'll tip our hat a little bit and say that we're gonna skip some of the heavier, more intricate heresies, because I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure they still show up. There are no new heresies. There are only new names. But I think these three who want to deny either Christ's divinity or Christ's humanity, do so because for some reason they want to protect God, and God needs no protecting. And I think that's a major temptation. When we read Scripture, we read all kinds of things into it that aren't there because for some reason we need to protect God. But no, Christ was fully human and fully divine to know what it was to be us and to save us.
Right. Yeah, I think it's still hard to believe. I think I would say probably kind of a mild form of Arianism is maybe more popular today. Arianism had trouble believing in the divinity of Christ, and I think that's one maybe it's an exaggerated form of Arianism is what I should say, but people who believe that Jesus was a good teacher, a good moral example, but is he God? A little squishy on that question.
I've literally had a Lutheran pastor tell me, this was 2001 in New Jersey, so we're talking about 19 years ago. But yeah, Jesus was just a rehash of David. Or think about like Jesus Christ Superstar. There's nothing particularly divine about the Jesus in that portrayal. Now I acknowledge, we're talking about art, and art does some different things, but there's still this hint of there are no new heresies, there are only new names.
Yeah. And so for me, I think it's important because there are all kinds of good codes of ethics and teachings you can live by. But to me, what makes Jesus different is that he was God and human, and that he is the way, the truth, and the life for us. I think once you leave that at the door, I personally think, many of his teachings are interesting, but I don't think they're necessarily any interesting than Gandhi or MLK or someone like that.
I was just going to say his teachings have significantly less meaning without the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection.
Right. You think about, would anyone have written these down, because Jesus did not write himself, would anyone have written these down if they did not come from this faith claim? I don't think they would have, honestly.
Well, we do have some of the teachings of some of the writers of roughly contemporaneous of Jesus, right? So, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I mean, there were rabbis and popular teachers all over the place back then. It wasn't
Nothing uncommon.
right. So where do you see, if you do, we've kind of touched on Arianism and Adoptionism, where do you think we see Docetism today?
So I think in general, people have a hard time with balance in both and, right? It's either law or gospel, but we really aren't great at doing both. It's either saint or sinner, but we're really not great at acknowledging both.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with Jesus, people are really good at either talking about Christ's divinity, or they're really good about talking about Christ's humanity. And I think sometimes for those people, and some of this is just my own experience, so this is all anecdotal, but they have seen an overemphasis, or what they perceive to be an overemphasis in one direction or the other, and so they overcorrect, right? But again, it gets back to protecting God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jesus was God, so obviously he, didn't take a crap. Or no, Jesus was also fully human, so Jesus took a crap. It may not be something we're pleased to think about. And don't get me wrong, some of this stuff is funny, right? Like, have you read Lamb?
Yes.
That's funny. It's also not orthodox, but you don't go reading Lamb or watching Jesus Christ Superstar for Orthodox Christian teaching necessarily. So Docetism in my head shows itself in like The Robe, some of the stuff that come out in the 50s where you never even see Jesus's face, let alone his feet.
Yeah.
Jesus is just fully divine.
I definitely see all those too. I'm thinking in terms of sometimes you almost see some of this in the Gospel of John, and I don't think John's Docetist. For one, John 20 is in there in case you had any questions. But this idea that Jesus is like the smartest guy ever, who knows everything that everyone's going to say, before they say it, who can instantly translate any language in the world if he wants to, or what,
oh, you mean like in the Passion of the Christ, where Jesus miraculously speaks Latin?
There you go. Like it's almost like Jesus really held one hand back when he was made incarnate. And I think actually one area I might argue, man, that's a weasel word, that you see Docetism in is kind of a denial of Jesus's particular Jewishness, that Jesus is the God of all people. Therefore, it doesn't really matter where he was born, or it doesn't really matter that he lived his life by all these Jewish laws. And I think Docetism kind of leads you that way. You don't have to deal with the human side of Jesus as much. So I think again, it's a problem in many ways. Gentiles, which includes all of us, bring into it. Focusing so much on Jesus as God that you kind of lose sight. Well, yes, he's God, but what does it mean that God became this son of a carpenter from Israel, or descendant of David?
And I think we talked about talking about some of this in a future picturesque, shall we say, episode. But I do think it's important also to acknowledge that while Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jew, it is okay that, if you're in Africa, Jesus is often depicted as being very African. And I've seen, very East Asian depictions of Jesus. And that's okay, as long as Jesus doesn't suddenly begin to look like me, sound like me, vote like me, and be my buddy, right? Because then I'm not worshiping Jesus, I'm worshiping me.
Right. Well, and you can see this by the fact that probably the most common image you and I and most of our viewers see of Jesus is a very white Jesus. And often we don't notice that. But if you draw an African Jesus, suddenly everyone's like, wait, Jesus wasn't African? It's like, well.
Well, actually.
Yeah.
And I intentionally left out the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian Jesus, don't get me wrong. Because I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that until it becomes an idol, right?
Right.
Because Jesus was, as I said, a first-century Palestinian Jew.
And it kind of makes the whole story of the Bible make more sense if you look at it that way. I mean, that's the problem with Docetism, really. Is you've kind of got this narrative, and then you've just got literally Deus Ex Machina. You're just airdropping this guy into the middle, and it's like, wait, why the heck did I just read all of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and the prophets if you're just going to have this random avatar show up and I mean, really, why would I need the rest of the story if Jesus is actually a Doceans?
I do want to get back to, you had said the Gospel of John could be read with some Docetistic tendencies, and I think you're right. You know, we don't see Jesus born. Jesus is handing out divine favors and doesn't seem to suffer from the cross, at least not as much. But I think that's already happening in the first and early second centuries, because there seems to be a response, right? And there's a theory that that's the reason that that the Johannine epistles, the 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John were written, right? Children, it is the last hour. As you have heard, this is from 1 John 2, 8, starting in 18. Children, it is the last hour. As you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But by going out, they made it plain that none of them belonged to us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and all of you have knowledge. There's that from a previous episode. I write to you not because you do not know the truth, but because you know it, and you know that no lie comes from the truth. Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Everyone who confesses the Son has the Father also. Oh, where is it?
What's the quote you're looking for?
I screwed it up. I'm sorry. Everyone who's watching this, I screwed it up. I'm sorry. It's
that would be kind of their shot at Arianism, against Arianism, I think.
Yeah, but where's the one that says the Antichrist is the one who denies that Christ has come in the flesh?
I think that might be 2 John.
I should have looked this up before now, but I'm thinking on the fly.
Let's see.
1 John 4, I wasn't far enough in the book.
Okay.
Sorry about that. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world.
And for our patient listeners, 2 John 7, many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist.
Wow.
He's very worked up about this.
Yeah, obviously there is some proto-Arianism and some proto-Docetism going on. That's why 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and again, written as a corrective to people who are misreading the Gospel of John. At least that's one theory. I think I stole that from Raymond Brown.
I think the Gospel of John, to which this community belongs, whether it's the same writer or not, I think it's created this problem by introducing a really big concept in John 1 that I think is in some ways implicit, but maybe toned down in comparison to the full-throated incarnational theology of John 1. And I think so. It's kind of their own fault that they then have to work out all the challenges to this issue, because as soon as you say that someone can be human and God, which seems to break all the rules we know, then you get lots of questions. And that's what theology does, is responding to questions, right?
Faith-seeking understanding, yes.
Yep.
And all of these, I mean, it sounds like we're talking about esoteric, impractical questions, but all of these have practical consequences which show up in our everyday world.
Yeah, I mean, the song, what if God was one of us? God was and is and will be.
Well said.
Being a Christian means never having to sing this song again.
I think we've covered it for this week. What do you think, Pastor James?
Yeah, I think we struck him down for another day or so. What's on tap for next week?
Oh, we're into Trinitarian heresies and why they matter next week. So, give me a second and I'll bring that. Oh, my computer's going to be slow now. Yeah, we're not Manichaeism.
No.
We are going to talk about Nestorianism and the sacraments, though, right?
At some point, but let's just say for now, the Trinity is not as easy as ABC or 1, 2, 3. You'll find out next week on Theology Thursday.
Theology Thursday. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll be there then.